Today, we're going to be reacting to luetin09's Aftermath of the Heresy, the Era of Ruin, and Scouring Begins. Please go support his channel, and the original video will be in the description. Thank you. Welcome to A Christian Reacts. So I do things a little bit differently on this channel, as I do react, but I also bring biblical commentary that is pretty close to the lore that is on the screen. I also do a Warhammer 40k lore in the Bible shorts series. So if you want to check that out, check out the shorts section on my watch page. Also check out W Energy Drinks. The discount link is in the description. And also check out the W Shakers, as those are made in the USA. So it's a good way to support businesses in the USA. Alright, let's go ahead and get this going. So, today I'm going to bring up the Golden Age, in that the Bible does talk about this Golden Age, which is where Satan and his rebellion first started, right? Because we know Satan fell before Adam, right? When he deceived Adam and Eve. And this is when Lucifer, yes, people, Lucifer is not Satan. Okay. Verse 16 literally calls him a man, and his name is Hillel ben Shahar. Shahar is a Canaanite god. I don't think Satan is the son of a Canaanite god, right? Lucifer, I would liken to Kronos and Saturn and like Osiris and stuff like that, right? This first Nephilim king. But anyways, we'll get to that when the time comes. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. It's like a sacrifice. You identify and commit the greatest betrayal possible. And it's like a sacrifice to anoint and begin fasting. Right? Oh, I screwed that up, didn't I? The aftermath of the heresy and the era of ruin. These are nice illustrations. I wish I had the technology to do that, man. I think it is kind of cool how Sanguinius is like, they grew, or he grew angel wings and stuff like that. Kind of goes with the biblical narrative and stuff. But anyways, I digress.
Now, as always, I apologise for the slight delay in productions. It was for one reason and another.
You're good.
But I want to talk today about the era of ruin, Malcador, and the new Scouring news. Now, in the wake of the siege upon Terra and the end and the death, there was a moment where the silence of the final battle between Horus and the Emperor resonated with even more power than the earth-shattering thunder that had preceded.
Real quick, about Sanguinius. Do you know what happened? I need to look that up. That's my fault here. But how he got the bloodlust and all that? That's my fault for not looking it up. But if anyone could tell me in the comments. Like I said, I'm light years behind of all the lore, So, anyways, I digress.
Did it. But all the while, Terra still burned. The ending of the Heresy in the Siege series tied together many details, but it also left us with questions unanswered. We did not see the Emperor in...
That is interesting. The dragon. Is that the picture of, like, the void dragon there? Or maybe... Because, if you guys don't know, Satan, right, is not a cherubim. He's literally called the serpent, or that old serpent, the dragon. Well, what entity can mean a dragon? A seraphim. Literally means fiery serpent. And in the book of Enoch, it talks about how Gabriel is over the serpents, excuse me, and the cherubim. So this is why I kind of get on the mainstream church a lot, right? Because they assume a lot of stuff that just isn't there. But anyways,
entombed upon the golden throne. The traitors were still very much present, and so the era of ruin became highly anticipated. And while I have not talked through the specific details about the Siege of Terror or the End and the Death trilogy, I have, of course, consumed them, which may then leave you to wonder, why haven't I spoken to them? And just before progressing much further today, I will, as always, note that given this material is relatively new, there are spoilers throughout this for the anthology Era of Ruin. But it's been out for several weeks now, so I feel like it's okay to discuss because it's quite a short book.
So you guys go. Just there's going to be spoilers here. So if you don't want that, then like move past it or whatever.
In the general scheme of things. Now, most often my reasoning as to why I don't always jump into these things has long been that I try to avoid getting onto new material too quickly, because I always feel that when it comes to the lore of 40k, there is near unlimited time in which to speak to something once it has been established. Also, that in 40k context is everything, and something may sit differently when it is contextualized further by adjacent or subsequent material. Then, of course, there's my standing puzzle analogy that I really don't see 40k as a linear thing and never have, because whilst timelines are great, 40k has never really followed any kind of linear framework for its overall picture. Sure, there are
well, it's got a million different things going on at once. You know, it's not focused on one character or whatever. It's focused on a million different characters, you know? So, yeah, I agree with that.
Series which do so, but in the collective whole, not so much. So while it might seem strange to speak to something like Era of Ruin before mentioning key material which came before, or even, of course, for me to really speak to figures like the Primarchs in significant detail, I've often found, and perhaps you have noticed this, that I tend to gravitate toward things which just capture a thought in my head at any given moment in time, which, for better or worse, is how my brain seems to function. Probably worse, to be honest, because I'm sure there are many algo-rich topics that I could have covered prior, but that are still on my to-do list. However, in saying that, I hope you can also perhaps appreciate that I'm still speaking from a position that is an immersive fascination.
So real quick for future YouTubers, you want to, if you're a small channel and you want to get views, you have to focus on things that the algorithm is pushing at the time. I'm starting to learn this. Also, pick a niche and post videos that's about that niche. Once you start straying away from that, YouTube won't push your videos. I'm starting to learn that. So, there you go.
Rather than ticking content boxes. As I've said a lot of times now, I've always found the more interesting details personally to be in the adjacent material, the short stories, the novellas, the random sidebar quotations. Whereas the major material tends to speak to more character-driven narratives. Yes, it tells a story which sheds light, but the smaller material tends to often sit a little closer to campaign supplements in their tone and information. They fill out the space between the lines, building out the broader picture. Now, there is an additional, I think, sliver of a clue worthy of speculative discussion. And for this, I cannot claim any credit at all. It goes to my good friends Kieran and Kieran. You can check them out over at their namesake channel, The Kieran Show, link on screen.
I'll have to do that.
And I do recommend you give them a follow and a sub. Check out their regular discussions, their mad 40k army 24-hour build challenges. But as far as I'm aware, they spotted this first. Back in 2022, when the Warhammer community team were speaking more about the potential Henry Cavill situation, at the bottom of one of the related community posts, they attached this half-ruined Aquila, the Imperial Eagle. This was the same Aquila posted by Cavill himself from his social media account. And
what's interesting in 2nd Esdras, it talks about a 3-headed eagle that becomes a 2-headed eagle, and that rules the earth. And if you look at all these insignias, like the Byzantine Empire and all that, and of course, you know, Russia and all that, and other things, we'll just say, they have this eagle. And what's interesting, in some people's view, when you see the point on the eagle, it actually stands for a phoenix. And in the Bible, there is a quote-unquote type of phoenix character named the Assyrian, also calls him Pharaoh, king of Egypt. See where I'm going with that? And then it also calls him the destroyer, which in the Exodus, right? He talks about the destroyer that, you would put the lamb's blood on the doorposts, right? And you won't suffer the destroyer. So, anyways, and in Isaiah 14, where it talks about Lucifer and all that, it also talks about the Assyrian. And it says he's a seraphim himself, but he comes like from the seed of a cockatrice, right? And then you'll see in the throne of God, you see this creature like a flying eagle, right? So, and this is where they talk about the cherubims and stuff too. But in my opinion, that flying eagle is this serpentine phoenix type deal, right? A seraphim or a burning one, right? So, anyways, and it could also mean fiery serpent as well.
And then we saw it again on the Era of Ruin book. Now, while it remains entirely speculative, it's quite hard to ignore the fact that this Aquila only appeared in a post related to the Cavil series even before the Era of Ruin was confirmed, and then now we saw it on the book itself, which leans towards suggesting that Amazon could well be basing whatever the series they're working on upon this Era of Ruin theme. Why else would you include that?
Yeah.
Which makes a lot of sense. It would most certainly have a strong Custodes lens. There would be a lot of heresy talk, which allows world building and establishing existing law parameters.
So while we're on the heresy thing, I do want to get into this golden age thing. So we're going to go to Second Esdras, which, by the way, Second Esdras is a extra biblical text, but it was put in the 1611 King James Bible. I can say that correctly, my goodness. Anyways, so this is Second Esdras 7:13. For the entrances of the elder world were wide and sure, and brought immortal fruit. All right, so let's go to this golden age here, right? This is on the wiki. By extension, the golden age denotes a period of primordial peace, harmony, stability, and prosperity. During this age, peace and harmony prevailed in that people did not have to work to feed themselves, for the earth provided food in abundance, right? We see this with Adam and Eve, that they didn't have to really work too hard, right? But when they fell, all of a sudden they had to work by the sweat of their brow and go through hardships and stuff like that. And by the way, I believe this is pre-Adam, right? And this is, you could say, like when Atlantis and all this stuff was, in my opinion. I'm going to bring up Atlantis as well, as you guys know, or have been on this channel quite a while. Anyways, sorry, I digress. They lived to very old age with a youthful appearance, eventually ending peacefully, with spirits living on as guardians. Now, in the book of Enoch, what does it say about the Nephilim? These hybrids, these angel-human hybrids, right? It says that since their spirits weren't made in heaven, they were stuck here on earth, and they will be known as evil spirits. This is in the first book of Enoch. And those are the demons. But you see how it twists it here? That the spirit living, with spirits living on as guardians, this also can be contributed to like the Raphaim, which are the invigorated ones, right? The invigorated giants. And so Rapha means to heal, to mend, to repair. And then you got Job, which talks about dead things are formed from under the waters and the inhabitants thereof. That's in Job. I forget the chapter, darn it. Anyways, I'm digressing here. So, you guys get the gist. Oh, so I'll read this. So, in classical Greek mythology, the Golden Age was presided over by the leading titan Kronos. This, in my opinion, is Lucifer, son of the morning, right? Lucifer would be considered a Nephilim king or a titan, right? You'll see in Genesis 6, it talks about how the angels mated with women and created giants. Now, I take a little bit, let's just say I have a different opinion on where it says, here, let me bring it up. Genesis 6. There's a part where it says that it happened before and then it also happened after that. I believe this is talking about the golden age first and then again in Noah's time. So I take a different approach than most people. Okay. So it came to pass that man began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. This is Genesis 6. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, so right here, there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that. So I believe that it's talking about the golden age, and then when Noah came onto the earth, right? And Enoch and all that. But that's my opinion. Anyways, sorry, that took a lot longer than I wanted
to do the heresy, which obviously would be astronomically expensive and almost impossible to do in terms of its scale.
And by the way, I'll bring more evidence of that. I just don't want it to be too long and bore you guys.
Emperor would be also out of sight, which is something I would imagine they very, very much want to do. Keep him as sort of this invisible entity that is spoken about remotely. It'd be very much still a very dramatic setting, but as I've noted before, it could well be very confusing for newcomers, which has been the issue, of course, with Dune as well. So while speculative, I've found this very, very difficult to ignore, because until now that symbol of the Aquila really only appeared in 3 forms. The Unification and Crusade era
Thunder
Raptor
Warriors,
Imperialis, right, which featured that single eagle head with lightning bolts, and that evolved into the Palatine Aquila seen in use by Space Marines in M30, M31, which now has a twin-headed eagle and also still those lightning bolts. Then, post-Heresy, they began over time to use what was now and would remain until M41, the Imperial Aquila, representing the various departments of the Imperium, and also symbolically that one blind eagle. The only other Imperial crest in common use is the Imperialis, seen used by Space Marines and elsewhere, say among the Imperial Guard. That's the winged skull, which I think is just simpler to say it has a variety of meanings, but it is effectively an army badge representing just loyalty to the Emperor. But what is not at all commonly seen is this artwork of a half-decaying Imperial Palatine Aquila, which, given its scarcity, really makes it fairly straightforward to draw conclusions from. Anyway, it's relatively concise to speak about, but I think very possibly there is something in this, because you just don't see it anywhere else.
Alright, real quick, we're going to talk about that ruin part. So, after that rebellion, we'll get into the rebellion and all that, but I want to put this out there. So, Genesis 1-2, or you got 1, hold on, let me go to the full chapter here. So it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then all of a sudden, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. Now, this deep is an actual entity, by the way. And I'll bring that up here. But it's an actual deep. And you look on Hela, the Norse goddess Hela. Half her face is darkened, and she's the goddess of the underworld, right? Or Helheim, or Niflheim. I've heard it been called both. So, anyways, which there's a well and rivers there, by the way, in the scripture I'll bring up. There's rivers, but anyways. And the earth was without form, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. So let's go to Isaiah 45:18. So that word there for without form and void is tohu vabohu. Okay. For thus saith the Lord God, or Isaiah 45:18. For thus saith the Lord God that created the heavens, God himself that formed the earth and made it. He hath established it. He created it not in vain. So not tohu. But we go in Genesis, it's tohu. Right? And the earth was without form and void. It says he didn't create it without form and void. He said he created it to be inhabited. So this is when the rebellion happened, right? In Warhammer 40k sense, the Horus heresy, right? This is when that happened. Well, of course, not the exact thing, but you guys get my gist. But there's this ruin that happens afterwards. There's some more verses that talks about it. I'll have to see if I can find it, where it talks about how there were no cities and everything like that. But anyways, so there's that.
Swinging back into the era of ruin, though, we return to a world where the Emperor now is placed unmoving upon his throne. The traitor Primarchs have been scattered. All that is left is the aftermath and the scouring to come, which I firmly believe we are on the cusp of, but it remains to be seen if that will actually be the direction things take. There are more reveals soon, so perhaps this is where things will go. Now,
Okay. So this is also talking about the Assyrian as well. So Ezekiel 31:4. So this is talking about the Assyrian. I'll show you it's talking about that Assyrian, that destroyer angel character, right? Son of man, speak unto Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and his multitude, whom art thou like in thy greatness? Behold, the Assyrian, oh wow, the Assyrian was a cedar in Lebanon with fair branches, and with a shattering shroud and of a high stature. His top was among the thick boughs. Now here's where the deep comes into play in her rivers. The waters made him great. The deep set him up on high with her rivers running about his plants, and sent out her little rivers unto all the trees of the field. This is Ezekiel chapter 31, by the way. So, and if you look in Hela, in Tiamat, and all that, there's rivers in this well. So it's very interesting. And yeah, so
hold off on
the
your
deep
comment
is an
because
entity.
that's what I originally wrote for this script. But as we just saw, it's now confirmed that the Scouring will be expanded into, which not only makes all the sense in the world, but it's extremely exciting. There is a lot to explore in the Scouring, and there's no question why it should happen. Not least, though, because we'll get to see what occurs with the Legions, the Primarchs, confrontations like Dawn and Guilliman. There's very obviously extremely minimal information about this yet, other than it will clearly be a multi-novel series like the Siege of Terror, I would imagine. And it's only my speculation, but I would guess that that's going to involve a couple of novellas as well. And this is what we sort of see here with the artwork. It's pretty much what you would expect. But understanding that the Scouring is coming also adds more weight to this era of Ruin anthology. Confirms what I've already said, which is that I like to often hold off and wait for a little more context, but especially if a story is not well defined or contextualized clearly.
That's what I always say, right? With every story and everything, always make sure they're get all the information first, right? And get both sides of everything and everybody's opinion on it before you make a decision on what you think it is, right? But anyways, this goes for me. Don't, when I bring up the biblical stuff, don't take my word at it. Look it up yourself. Get the information, all the information that I give you, and make sure things be true, right? But anyways,
that's not really the case with the era of Ruin, but nonetheless,
oh,
generally in 40k, I find that addition.
Okay, so this is Jeremiah 45. Okay, right. So Jeremiah 4:23 through 25. And I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void. So there it is again, right? And the heavens, and they had no light. I beheld the mountains, and lo, they trembled, and all the hills moved lightly. And I beheld, and lo, there was no man. And all the birds of the heavens were fled. So something happened here. I beheld, and lo, the fruitful place was a wilderness. So it was fruitful before, right? Like we had here, 2nd Esdras, that one scripture for entrances of the elder world were wide and sure, and brought immortal fruit. So there we go. And behold, lo, the fruitful place was wilderness, and all the cities thereof were broken down at the presence of his Lord and his fierce anger. For thus saith the Lord, the whole land shall be desolate. So before it wasn't desolate, right? Yet will I make a full end, for this shall the earth mourn, and the heavens above be black, because I have spoken it. I have purposed it, and will not repent, which means turn away from it. Neither will I turn my back from it. So there you go. There was this. So the earth had form, right? It was meant to be inhabited, like we saw in Isaiah there. But then all of a sudden in Jeremiah and Genesis 1:2, it talks about it's without form and void. Jeremiah says the cities are gone out of it. And also it says there were no man. So there were men before it. We're going to see in Isaiah 14 when we talk about Lucifer, there were nations on the earth. So, anyways, so I don't believe Adam was the first. Also, if you look on the sixth day, it says man and women were created. Male and female were created, and it sounds different than what we get in Adam and Eve. And then it even goes to where God didn't use incest or anything like that because it goes against His commandments, right, and His law. So why would God do that? Well, because there may have been people that weren't of the line of Adam and Eve. So that's how Cain and all that. Well, Cain knew his sister, right? But Seth and all them, the good guys, right? Anyways, sorry.
Framing is beneficial. The era of ruin does give us some shockingly specific details as well, which is not typical for most material. Usually things are just kind of implied. But the opening stories in Era of Ruin are vague and more general. They are just addressing the question of what did the end of the siege feel like when the vast vortex of power was consumed in that psychic.
And by the way, this is probably going to be in 2 parts because this is going to be a long one. So this will probably be in 2 parts.
Backdraft where we saw the death of Horus, what remained in the aftermath. We have broken marines wandering the destroyed landscape, loyalist, heretic. In some instances it's difficult to differentiate between the two. Only Astartes who had endured and found themselves upon the ashen wastelands and the ruined debris of terror would be able to tell. I think people had expected Era of Ruin to be more of a hard-hitting, explosive summary to the events that had preceded it. That's certainly what I expected, and I won't lie, I was initially a little disappointed with the pace and clarity, and I heard that from others as well. But this is the reason why I often don't post immediate reactions, because in my experience you need time to digest, reflect, contextualize material.
I don't know about the Terminus Decree though, man. That just makes no sense to me, but anyways, I digress.
Especially when it comes to the lore, in my opinion. Era of Ruin, I believe, was in fact more of a meditation on what and who remains. It sets the tone and the scene, the transition from one era to another. The Crusade and the Heresy is over. The Emperor has been placed upon the throne. Those who survived must find their own way. And this is what we feel, especially in the beginning. Interestingly, they segmented the book by 2 clear quotations. And normally, with most Black Library material, you may have a heavy prologue or a quote at the opening to a novel. You may have small quotes at the beginning of every chapter. In Era of Ruin, the book is clearly divided into the stories within the section of the first quote and those following the second. And whether this was a deliberate structural choice or not, I don't know, but that's how I interpreted it anyway, because within the first section, the stories feel more about those who survived and find themselves in the wilderness. They seem lost. They've got no real sense of what may come next. But before we delve into the narrative shape of the text itself, it's worth stepping back and acknowledging the wider context.
That probably would be a little rough. You see this, the Great Crusade and this golden era of, the Emperor and, getting his subjects back, the Primarchs and all that. And then all of a sudden, you got this Horus heresy that goes and then Terra's destroyed. I mean, not fully destroyed, of course, but a lot of destruction everywhere, right? On all these planets and stuff like that. That would be kind of rough. It would definitely be disheartening.
Which surrounds its arrival. For many, the end of the Siege of Terror wasn't simply the conclusion of an arc, it was the culmination of a literary journey. The Heresy series is over 50 books. It shaped a generation of readers, writers, and hobbyists, and it defined how the lore would become so deeply stratified within 40k. It was also just a fascinating concept in the sense that we knew the ending from the very beginning. I've always joked that people complain about spoilers, but the biggest one of all, that the Emperor dies, was always known. I guess that makes the entire Heresy like one gigantic Columbo episode in many ways. But it is intriguing to consider how that knowledge informed the tone of the material. You're approaching it in some respect with a sense of mourning right from the beginning, but this is stacked against the extreme anticipation of understanding with each piece a larger element of the entire puzzle. I don't think that the Era of Ruin arrived as just a footnote. I think of it as more a cross-medium transition. The literature, the miniatures, the setting itself, all are pivoting. It is not a triumphant opening to a new age, nor an epilogue to the last. It's more the silence that sits between, which might sound a little bit overdramatic, I admit, but I think that's what it was really intended to be. And in that sense, it's not really aiming to please anybody. It just exists in that space.
Hey,
Lastly, if we're talking about
that works.
expectations, post-Siege, these are very obviously innumerable. For me, in the Scouring, personally, I'm looking for gravity and fallout. What I mean by that is the final trilogy in the Siege of Terror, The End and the Death, were truly amazing books, but they also felt like a warp-crazed journey, which in many ways they were. I've not really read anything like it in my life because of the sheer saturation of detail, the fact that many of the chapters were quite short.
You know, one of my favorite parts on the book, The Old Earth, I hope I'm remembering this correctly. Numion, you know, one of the salamanders, they went through the warp, you know, to get to Earth, whatever, or wherever they were trying. I gotta remember, to get Vulcan and to revive him and all that. And to do that, they had to go back through the warp. And I remember at the time, I was like, what are you doing? You know, you just went through the warp and went through hell and back, right? And now you're going to do that again? But I actually, when I thought about it down the line, that I was like, you know what? That takes a lot of faith. You know what I mean? So I thought that was pretty cool. So Numion is probably one of my favorite salamanders, in my opinion. But anyways.
And it would go between one thing and another, and you had to keep all of this stuff in your head, lots and lots of moving parts. There's just so much happening, characters fulfilling that arc, revelations of history, descriptions of terror itself effectively being...
I read that book a while ago, and I hope I'm remembering it correctly and from the right book, but anyways.
Consumed by the warp and the palace unmaking itself. It was a very wild ride, and often just so much happening. It's hard to keep a clear track in your mind, which is one of the reasons, again, why I haven't kind of covered it, because I think having read 3 gigantic books, I actually need to go back and then sift through them at a granular level, which is, you know, not particularly appealing, it's got to be admitted, but that is roughly what I will plan to do at some point. And I would be probably interested.
Well, a good way to kind of, like, this is how I study the Bible, right? I look at it as a cow, right? You chew it up, you chew the grass and the cud, right? I know this might sound gross, but you digest it, right? Then you spit it back up, right? So you go back and you look it up again, and then you digest it, and vice versa. Go over and over again until you kind of understand the context of what's going on, right? So you keep eating it, and you know, basically you get what I mean. But anyways, that's a good way of studying anything.
To do it. But I think that's why the Era of Ruin exists, to create that space. And what I want to see beyond that is some sense of grounding, literary gravity pulling us back to the reality, and then the brutal fallout, the rage of the loyalists, the bitter spite and venom of the traitors, each attempting to find their new place in the galaxy, the shattered ideologies, the emotional wreckage of those who survived. What I'm saying is that if Era of Ruin was necessary detoxification, a tonal choice, that's fine, but it also really refused to answer the question of what comes next. And that's...
So real quick too, I want to give some more reinforcing of that golden age thing, right? There were people and all that. So Isaiah 44:7, and who, as I shall call, and shall declare, and set in order for me, since I appointed the ancient people. So this is an Isaiah, right? This isn't New Testament stuff, right? And the things that are coming, and shall come, let them shew unto them. Fear not, neither be afraid. Haven't I told thee from that time, and have declared it? Ye are even my witness. Is there a God beside me? Yea, there is no. And God I know not any. That they make... Oh, anyways. So there was this ancient people. But anyways.
That's a question which absolutely must be answered in whatever form follows in the Scouring. Guilliman, Dawn, all the other Primarchs in the aftermath, the reforging of the legions, the beginnings of the Codex. I think the administrative and strategic discussions between the vacuum of power struggles which are going to exist is where I want to see things go now. And that can be beautifully juxtaposed with brutal heretic hunting carried out by seething loyalist Marines. There's so much to explore, and I'm very excited to see where things go. We've spent years, decades, in fact, watching the slow fall into darkness. The heresy was never going to be about winners and losers because we already knew the result from the outset. So it was about what 40k does best of all, truth being bludgeoned into myth. The Era of Ruin does not attempt to dramatize what is already known, because why would you need to do that other than fan service? Instead, it's a long process of making sense of what came before through the trauma, disillusionment, and the characters who know.
So real quick too, in the Timaeus, which is what Plato writes about Atlantis, and I'll bring that up probably in the next part because this is going too long already. But he talks about how the war of the Atlanteans and these barbarian tribes and all that, which God does say is going to bring up the nations against that city. But anyways, I digress. Where was I? Oh, he says that was 9,000 years before him. So I believe, with the golden age and all that, the earth is a lot older. Now, it's not millions, right? There are people, secularists, that say that humanity could have been on the earth 20,000 years. Or not humanity, but, well, anyways, I digress. So the earth might be around, I would say, 12,000 years old. So very interesting. Because if you think it's around 2,000 years from Plato, from us, right? And then 9,000 years then, which would have been like 11,000 years. So the earth is probably a lot older than just 6,000. I know that goes against the grain, but the evidence says so, in my opinion. So there you go.
Longer know how to make sense of the reality they exist in. Because if the siege ended in this firestorm, then the Era of Ruin begins in the ashen fog of personal ambiguity.
Desolation.
The first section of stories begins with the quote, "Pity the dead, pity that they will not see the ages to come and all the wonders that their acts have wrought." The words etched on the stones of remembrance, the Dome of Unity, the Imperial Palace, Terror. The quote is exactly the sort of thing you'd expect to see carved into a vast marble monument column within the Imperial Palace, except its purpose is less to document than it is to comfort those who need to believe that all the suffering and loss had a purpose, a memorial to the fallen of Terror. But when we think about it within the context as we understand it, it reads less like reassurance and more like dissociative delusion. Because the deaths, the sacrifices, the obliteration of entire cultures have not wrought wonder, not the promises of the Golden Emperor, no new age of enlightenment. They have fashioned merely an extension of survival, and barely that. The three opening stories, Angels of Another Age, Fulgurite, and Fragments, are not a celebration of victory. They show us what remains when all the grand drama and mythos fall away. There's no great struggles for a defensive line.
So this is kind of just my opinion on it, right? Religion puts an institution between you and God, right? Instead of getting the information yourself, right? Wherever I put it, reading the Bible itself, right? Which that's the authority, not any man, right? That's why I tell everybody, don't pay attention to what I say. I mean, you can listen, and see what I have to say, but don't take it as truth, right? Get the information yourself. Stop letting others think for you, right? And unfortunately, that's what religion does. Now, I'm not like anti-religious or whatever, because I believe in God, but you have to stop making it a quote-unquote religion and start making it a relationship between you and God. Let God talk to you and stuff like that. Y'all may think it's crazy, but hey, get the information yourself, is what I'm trying to say.
No battles for the Saturnine, no immense Dark Age machinery of war, no Primarchs locked in bitter combat. All has ground to a halt. In the first, Angels of Another Age, we see the horrifying aftermath of the great battles. The Astartes are utterly broken physically and mentally, their bodies and armour just ruined to the bone. They're blackened, they are remnants of what they were. Kaistos Gilon is one such remnant, a single shard fragment of a legion that no longer understands itself. A blood angel caught in the maelstrom of the Black Rage following the death of Sanguinius. The story is not for glory or heroic last stands. It's not about purpose or duty or serving the Emperor or the Primarch or just doing what must be done no matter the cost. We simply see the psychological collapse of one of the Emperor's angels, a figure who once Imperial servants would have knelt to, served, tended him to his maximal efficiency. But he is no heretic, no traitor, no renegade, but he also has no future, for any future which exists now has no place for him. His sacrifice dies in darkness, unrecognized and unwanted. His death will not save anything, not buy more time, not hold the line for one more hour or day, because there's nothing left to save now. The war is not over, but his part in it is already forgotten. I personally really loved this first opening story. It reminded me very much of Censure, because it captivates and captures that core truth of grounded reality for the Astartes in nothing.
So now this doesn't have to do much with the Black Rage, but it is interesting. So Psalm 2:1-4. Why do the heathen rage, and the people imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, Let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us. He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall have them in derision. So, interesting. Maybe that's why they do what they do, we'll just say.
Glorious, nothing
The
to be
kings
carved
of the
into
earth,
the
we'll
Imperial
just
Palace.
say.
Instead, it's just these things are for the living who must lie to themselves about what the dead achieved, as per that opening quote. And people are constantly saying more than ever, where's the grim darkness?
And that goes with the principalities, right? And the Bible talks about the prince of Greece, the prince of Persia. These are like fallen angels, basically, right? So it's not just talking about men, it's talking about these fallen angels.
40k, 30k. Well, I mean, it's right here. This single small short distilled everything about the sacrifice, the horror, the dystopian, bleak darkness of the age of the Imperium which it now enters. You see this human raised into a superhuman form, honoured, respected, but now totally discarded. They're just left raging, rampaging, slashing through the mud and the filth and the detritus, the blood, walking on into darkness.
Yeah.
And as we learn soon, there's no salvation, no one to save them in death. The Emperor, as ever, is a lie. This crushing darkness, the hopelessness as we leave Gilon, waging a singular personal crusade into the abhorrent monsters that come to him. It's very dark and it's very somber, and it's a great opening.
Here's something to kind of think about too. Look at all the, let's say, the angels and all that fell. All of a sudden, they don't have that life that they had. And yeah, they blame us and everything of God because they don't have that anymore, and that's why they're raging. But anyways, I digress. Man, I can't stop
Then we
drinking this
come
coffee.
to Fulgurite. Now, Fulgurite is a culmination of Nick Kime's
Vulcan
sagas
lives.
surrounding an array of themes and topics, but primarily Vulcan and the namesake Fulgurite. Now, Fulgurite is not a weapon nor a ritual artifact. It's not a tool of strategy. It's a scar. It's also referred to as a lightning stone,
Yep.
which I think some may recall could be connected to the church of the same name, in that infamous short, The Last Church. It seems very
Yeah, okay. I was going to say that.
likely
But anyways,
that the foundational object of that church, said to have healing powers, was in fact a remnant of the Emperor's power, which makes all the sense in the world, hence why he felt the need to ensure its destruction. And when the Emperor unleashes his full psychic presence anywhere, the warp becomes this conduit for pure destruction. He's channeling it, focusing it. And upon earthing that psychic lightning, Fulgurite is formed. Glass-like shards are left behind, the crystallized memory of the Emperor's distilled psychic energy. This story, though, is a final chapter for one Bath.
so this is kind of interesting here. Satan. So this is Luke 10:18. And Luke 10:18, and this is Jesus saying, and he said unto them, I beheld Satan as lightning fall from heaven. So, and you see this quite a bit, like, or not quite a bit, but like in the book of Enoch and all that some of these angels may have been imprisoned in this lightning form, which makes you wonder if they could connect to computers and stuff like that. But anyways, but you saw here, he said Satan fell as lightning fall from heaven. So, interesting.
Thusa Narak of the Word-Bearers Legion. Although outwardly
And something to think about is this how sorcerers get their power. Because some of these, and Paul, he talks about the elementals, right? The stoichion. And it's not talking about the law of God, by the way, because Galatians weren't Jewish. They weren't Israelites. They were Gentiles. So it's not talking about the law. He's talking about the stoichion, these elemental spirits. But anyways, I digress.
aligned with his traitor brethren, Narak's true loyalty and journey always remained with the Emperor. He was wounded in the outbreak of the heresy conflict and would then be tasked with retrieving an ancient artifact, the Fulgurite, primarily because these shards of the Emperor's...
And guys, I'm going to go over the rebellion of Satan and Lucifer and stuff like that in the next one, because this is going to be long already. So I'm going to have to stop it at 30 minutes here. But anyways, just letting you know.
lightning are believed to hold the power to kill even a perpetual or a primarch. Narak secured the Fulgurite through contact with the Cabal agent, John Grammaticus, and by now he was determined to prevent the Word-Bearer's descent into corruption, and so he resolved to recover the Fulgurite and use it to kill Lorgar. So Narak still believed the Emperor to be the true divine being, as the Word-Bearers once felt, and so he thought if he could destroy his own Primarch, maybe he could reduce the severity of the Word-Bearer's fall, maybe even salvage something of the Legion. His quest took him to many places, Macragge, where betrayal by his own brothers forced him into hiding, but he succeeded in locating Grammaticus, and Narak was wounded again and ultimately subdued by Conrad Kurz. He was later discovered near the body of Vulcan and imprisoned by the Ultramarines, wrongfully accused of the Salamander's Primarch's murder, but would then be freed through an agent of Malkador and joined a band of Salamander survivors attempting to return Vulcan's body to Nocturne. Middle, he found himself fighting off loyalists.
So that's where Numion in the book, or I think it's Guild Earth, right? Where that's why Numion went through the warp again to go through hell and back, and went to Nocturne, and they revived Vulcan. So, anyways, it's a good book in my opinion. I know a lot of people don't like Nick Kimes in the Salamanders, but I enjoyed that book. But anyways, I digress.
loyalist and traitor alike, to where he finds himself upon the surface of Nocturne, where he encounters who other than Eldrad Ulthuan. And this is a time where the Cabal is still a thing, which I won't go into explaining again, but Eldrad recruits him to eliminate any remnants of that organization, after the successful conclusion of which Eldrad gifts him once again with a fragment of the Fulgurite. Narek is then able to reinsert himself among the Wordbearers and plans to use the ongoing invasion of Terra as a means to reach Lorgar. But he is unfortunately unaware that Lorgar had already been banished from Horus's ranks. So then we come to here, Fulgurite in the Era of Ruin. Narek in this short is wandering the destroyed wilderness of Terra. And the atmosphere is just great, because despite him being a wordbearer, it's not immediately clear among anybody who is encountered whether they're a traitor, loyalist or deserter, which I think speaks very much to the atmosphere at the end of the siege. There's just utter abject confusion, chaos everywhere, not literally, and nobody knows what is going on, and in some instances time itself is still attempting to resolve into regular order. And despite near-fatal wounds, Narek is saved by one of the loyalists and continues his search, following what he believed to be the psychic pull of the Fulgurite. He's accompanied by a ragged band of ordinary guardsmen who've attached themselves to him in the hope of survival. But they're set upon by bizarre, twisted beings, and they manage to escape into a bunker facility, but Narek is wounded. He awakens to find the humans having patched him up, and they're now wondering what to do in this abandoned facility. But he feels sure that he can sense something still within this place. So they decide, rather than going outside to their deaths, to descend into the underground facility, but unfortunately what awaits them inside is little better than the outside. Within they find Fabius Bile, who in the eyes of Narek has entirely lost his sanity, and to be fair, Fabius had already begun to heavily disconnect from the standard of order of things even prior to the heresy. But at this point, he is all but fully converted into the nightmare.
Definitely an edgelord. He's got the corset and everything, right? Definitely a gothic edgelord. But anyways.
Genius he would become much later and through to M41. So Narek and his group are set upon again by another of these weird creations. They barely escape with the aid of the rabble guardsmen at his side. Once again in the wasteland, Narek and his group press onward, but eventually he encounters Erebus. And this is where he will meet his end. It was all a deception. Lorgar, of course, was never here. Erebus says a lot of Erebus things, and I'll just use the opportunity here to say this. I often find that many people have a good understanding of...
Once Erebus was in play there, you can kind of figure out what's happening. Anyways.
Of the Sons of Horus, the Night Lords, the World Eaters, Death Guard, the Wordbearers, though, not always so much. But in the same way that I find people do not understand the Ultramarines, because what defines their goals and their driving force is not particularly clear at the surface level. And so, to this end, I would suggest checking out the Primarch series novel Lorgar, Bearer of the Word. The Primarch series in general is very, very useful because of how much context they all provide. But with Lorgar's one, it really digs into the core of who he is, and also you have Corphaeron as well. But if you do go and check it, you're going to want to do the audiobook or Black Library ebook version, because if you want a physical copy, you're looking at £50 to £100 on eBay, as is tradition.
Nope.
Fulgurite, though, is a nicely succinct end to the tale of Barthusa Narek. Interesting also that Erebus is still here on Terra, despite the world being in its death throes in the aftermath of the Emperor's battle.
You know, that reminds me of the... What are they? Helibites? Cenobites. Or, right? Cenobites? From Hellraiser is what that reminds me of. The Cenobites? I can't remember what they're called. I can't believe that. Anyways, that's what it reminds me of, is Hellraiser.
With Horus. So you see that the traitors did not just flee like bugs under a rock as soon as everything was finished. And that's one significant takeaway. The other is the possible glimpse in the final wording, and that is perhaps suggestive of Narek being a true loyalist despite everything, maybe headed for the salvation of the Emperor. But that's something which remains still entirely debatable. So then we come to the third, Fragments, which stays within the tone of the first two, but Dan Abnett strips it back here. There's no legions, no all-consuming endless war. It's about survivors sifting through the ruins and trying to remember what the heresy, or indeed any of this, was all supposed to mean. We see through the view of a silent sister, Aphone, and she describes to us the lonely isolation of what it means to be a blank or a null.
So, anyways, like where it says that there were no humans and the cities were destroyed and all that. You see, like with Noah's time, with Genesis 6 and all that, that through just, 1,000 years, they were able to corrupt pretty much most of humanity, with this hybridization, right? And in Joshua 4, of course, it talks about how men started mixing one species with the other. So there's like your griffins and, satyrs and stuff like that. And of course, they became the demons as well, because they don't have a spirit in heaven. Well, excuse me. Got a lot of air in me today. But anyways, but yeah, they were able to corrupt the earth in just a short amount of time, really. But anyways, I digress.
Null, not wanted by anyone, not even your own family. And so she spends her entire life in isolation. Much like the first, this describes to us the end state of the conflict, staring into the ashes and wondering what comes next. The story.
And I should say too, like Satan, it says Satan can transform into an angel of light. And then you see in the book of Enoch, let me see if I can find that real quick. It says that they took many different forms and defiled themselves, right? So, let me bring that up first. Enoch. Many forms. Okay. Okay. So this is chapter 19. And Uriel said to me, "Here shall stand the angels who connected themselves with women, and their spirits, assuming many different forms, are defiling mankind, and shall lead them astray into sacrificing into demons as gods. Here shall they stand." So they're able to transform. That's why you see one day this god is a human, and then one day he's like a human bird and whatever, right? So there you go. They're able to transform themselves.
Story tied to is
Lucifer probably
for nearly
himself as
all
well.
who survived the Siege of Terror, all that remains are now pieces of a reality that had stood before. There's a devastating loss of hope. Aphone cannot even imagine the future that will replace the one she had, until now, believed in. It's again a very short story, but one which felt to me much like loyalists screaming into the void. There's this sense that, although having achieved a technical Pyrrhic victory, they're just utterly broken. There's a moment in this one where Aphone is holding a traitor's head and just stands screaming, "Look at me!" And what you've probably not that deep of a voice though, what you feel is the sense that loyalists have become all too aware that in the new age of darkness, no salvation is coming. There's just this sense of overwhelming exhaustion. Without the Emperor to lead, there's a consolidating sense also of failure, even though they technically were victorious. But as with the End and the Death and the Siege of Terror series, I think to fully understand why they land so heavily, you have to have been able to place them within the broader arc and series of the Heresy itself. I often say how with the Heresy novel series, you can read the first 5, and then after that, what you want to do, whether you want to jump around or read it all the way through just straight, it won't really matter too much, apart from obviously some which are a series.
Good to know.
But with the Siege of Terror and into the Era of Ruin, it's a bit different. I think you really need the context from what has led to that point in time. It's why I wouldn't recommend somebody just start with the Siege of Terror, personally. I think you at least need to get those first 5 books and a few others to then come into it, because it's just...
Again, get all the information right before you make an opinion on it.
Too many specific details which would be meaningless. And so
Luton,
in
he's the
fragments, as
goat
with the angels, you
of
get that
war.
strong sense of despair that can only be felt in the shadow of that epic series. I don't think you would feel these short stories strong enough if you didn't have everything that which went before. Because the betrayal of Horus was not simply about just some military revolt. It was more like an orchestrated ideological collapse. The
Yeah.
war began as a rejection of the Emperor's secular, human-centric vision. Horus and his followers were just consumed by arrogance, the hypocrisy of everything, the contradictions, the impossible burdens of...
So the rebellion of Satan and Lucifer, it was, so you have God and the Word, which of course we know the Word as Jesus. And it literally, it says, the Word was with God, nothing was created and everything was created for him and by him, stuff like that. So they're interchangeable. The Word and God are interchangeable, but it says he put the government on his shoulders, right? The word soldiers, or the word's shoulders, which is Jesus, right? So he is the king, crowned by God, basically. Well, Satan wanted the same thing. Now, I used to think, Lucifer was the son of the Assyrian, but he's not. There are some things that indicate that he actually may be the son of Satan. So, I'm not 100% sure on that, but it is very interesting. And you see the dichotomy that's going there, right? Satan wanted to put his son on the throne, right? Just like the Word is the only begotten Son of God, same thing with Satan, right? He's a false imitation. That's all he knows what to do, right? Is to be like God. God can create, Satan, he mimics, is what he does. That's his main thing, right? But anyways.
expectation than the imperial truth. Lorgar and of course Erebus, in his search for meaning, tore open the veil of chaos. Horus and Mortarion just walked through the door. Fulgrim fell into the pits of impossible excess, and Perturabo turned against the very ideals of order that he'd once upheld. Kurz, I think, basically just imploded and was trapped by his own nightmare of reality. I always think Kurz kind of just trapped in his own head and kind of just, like I say, he goes mad and kind of implodes. Then you do have Magnus, but he remains still, for me, something of a question mark. Yeah, he broke the Emperor's great work on Terra, but he gets a pretty raw deal, as we've discussed before. The Loyalists, though, weren't immune to just...
He didn't want, from what I know, he didn't really want to fall to chaos, but he kind of used too much sorcery, I guess, per se, right? Which then transformed himself, and then, yeah, we all know the story on that, but anyways.
Becoming twisted by the descent into darkness either. You've got the burning of Prospero, which not a victory really for law and justice. The Dark Angels were and remain riven by internal division. The Iron Hands shattered themselves. Vulcan was broken, remade, and lost. Salamanders just despair. Guilliman and Dawn were both consumed by the very best and worst traits of themselves. And then, of course, Sanguinius, compelled by fate. So that all in all, by the time the Siege of Terra begins, the heresy had already significantly hollowed out both sides.
Not touching anything.
The aftermath reveals painfully that slow death of idealism. Every victory at the smallest scale for the Loyalists is Pyrrhic. Every traitor put down is too high of a price. The walls of the palace are not just broken by the physical siege, they're buried under the weight of meta...
So you see this guy here, this huge dreadnought, right? You look in First Enoch, not Ezekiel, but First Enoch, it talks about how these giants or these titans were around 4,000 ells, which is very, very, very tall. So, interesting.
The physical deception, corruption, and the impossibilities of the conflict.
And by the way, First Jude 1:14 through 16, and you can read all of that. It gives a nod to Enoch and his prophecies, and then it pulls straight from First Enoch, or First Enoch chapter 1. So that's a good endorsement, I would say, of the book of Enoch.
Conflict that is placed upon them. The death of Sanguinius, the wounding of the Emperor, the destruction of entire genetic stockpiles and billions dead. The final conflict of the heresy saw the unrestrained trauma.
That is a cool scene right there. You see the bullet holes through his wings there, and he's still fighting. That is pretty cool. I like that. You can see the mentality of Sanguinius all in this picture, right? So, anyways.
Of a species tearing itself apart. And so when Horus is finally slain, the momentum carries onward. It doesn't just stop. It mutates
and something to think about too. I bet you there was human on humans going on. You had your humans that were loyal to God, and then your humans that were loyal to Lucifer. And I wonder if they took a mark. Just saying. Anyways.
Calcifies. And so what we know will become the Scouring inevitably begins not as justice, but as a purge. And this is what you feel in
So I should clarify. So God says he puts a mark on people's heads, right? A sign. And you see in Revelation, it talks about, the locusts that come up from the bottomless pit, that they don't touch the people with the seal of God in their forehead, right? Well, it's the same thing with the beast. The beast in their forehead or in their right hand, right? Now, I believe the mark of the beast is going to change your DNA, right? It's going to disconnect you from God's voice and all that. And it's going to connect you to his voice and stuff like that. Because you see in 2 Thessalonians, was it 2 Thessalonians? Anyways, where it talks about that the beast will sit in the temple of God. Well, Paul tells us, he says, don't you know that you are the temple of God and that the Spirit of God lives in you? So the beast will be able to live in you. And I wonder how that could happen. Let's just say there's a Stargate thing out there. Anyways.
Fragments. The Sister of Silence has nothing to tell now other than just her own story. There isn't a greater story. And she rages against the void that has denied anything more. So now we move into the section which I've titled Revelations. Because...
Alright, I'm going to have to stop it there before this gets too long. Anyways, guys, thank you for watching. And those who liked the video, thank you. If you disliked it, thank you for at least giving me a chance. But anyways, we'll pick this up, on the next, on part 2. And we'll talk about the rebellion of Lucifer and Satan. Anyways, you guys have a wonderful day.